Good morning, everyone. I'm Kara Sundlun, and we want to bring you an update to what's happening in the war in Ukraine. President Joe Biden's trip to mark the anniversary of the war in Ukraine is now highlighting an even more grave challenge and showing that the U.S. is fully committed to helping Ukraine win this war. I'm joined by Matthew Schmidt, who is actually in Kyiv right now in Ukraine. He's an expert on national security and Russian relations. He's also an associate professor at the University of New Haven of National Security, International Affairs and Political Science. Welcome. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us as you are there in the middle of all of this right now.
You're welcome. It's my pleasure.
So what did the president's trip this week do for the entire conflict? Was this a game changer?
It was. For Ukrainians, it was a sort of an early victory. It represented that Ukraine was a full member of the West, that the West accepted Ukraine as sharing its values and its institutions and its commitment to, to freedom. So whatever happens on the battlefield, Ukraine won that. The reason they're fighting this war is to be fully accepted by the West. And the president of the United States traveling to the capital of the country in the middle of wartime, standing there while the air raid sirens are going off, right? That was the absolute signal that the West was not going to back down, that the United States was committed to making sure that Ukraine wins this war against Russia.
Well, and you mentioned Russia. I think that's what every person's biggest fear is, because we're here, while President Biden says he's fully committed, President Putin has been somewhat, I guess, unpredictable. He's now saying he's not going to participate in the arms treaty. And of course, regular citizens are worried about what happens next. Are we on the brink of World War III? What do you want to say about how our relations are going to be with Russia and how that affects the safety of everyone living here?
Well, first of all, I would say we are not on the brink of World War III, and Vladimir Putin is not crazy. He follows the logic, and he's very predictable. We don't agree with that logic, but it's a logic nonetheless. He doesn't go outside of it. He has every reason to avoid World War III. He has every reason to avoid coming into contact with NATO. Russia's power rests in its military and in its strategic rocket forces, its nuclear forces. If he were to do something to draw NATO in, his military would be defeated. Look at what Ukraine is able to do against his military. Now imagine NATO getting in there. He understands that if he does that, if he loses his military capability, then Russia doesn't have any power on the world stage. It simply doesn't, and he loses the thing, that he's fighting for. So there are strong incentives for him to avoid bringing the West in.
So they both agreed, both Putin and President Biden agreed. They disagreed on who started the war, right? President Biden saying, of course, that we're here to defend against Russia's aggression. And Putin is telling his people that it's self-defense, but they both seem to agree that this is going to go on for a long time. What's your take on that? Do we see an ending? How do we get this to actually return to some level of peace?
Well, war is the realm of chaos, and I would be reluctant to try to predict anything, but I could talk about scenarios. Ukraine needs to end the war as soon as possible because their economy can't hold on much longer. Their economy contracted about 30%. Again, imagine if that had happened to the U.S. economy, how difficult that would be. So they do need to bring this to a close as best they can. On the other hand, they have committed over and over again to the restoration of their pre-2014 boundaries, which means that they are committed to pushing Russian forces out of the country or to pushing Putin into a corner such that he withdraws those forces. And Ukraine has the capability to do it. But whether that happens in a year or longer than that is really anyone's to say. And Russia, despite having shown a real lack of combat capableness in this war, still has a lot of men, a lot of guns, a lot of ammo. And they can hold on for a long time.
Talk about what's happening to the people of Ukraine.
Well, the president's speech was a huge source of pride. that he came here. And then Putin's speech, of course, was the opposite. Most Ukrainians just shrugged their shoulders and said, whatever, it's the same thing he's been saying all the time. And Ukrainians are pretty sanguine about Vladimir Putin. They're sort of like, hey, we know this guy, right? We know when to take him seriously and when not to. They often sort of chuckle at the things that the West is stressed about that Putin is saying because they don't believe Putin's going to do it, having dealt with him for this long. Remember, Americans tend to forget the Ukrainians have been at war since 2014. This thing didn't just start in February. They've had forces in the field since 2014. But they're ready to, to have the war end at the same time. They're tired of it. They're tired of going to funerals, right? They're tired of not having jobs. They're tired of having to go through checkpoints every day and not having access to the full country. So, we're reaching up where there's a lot of emotional pressure to end the war.
We're hearing noise behind you. I know when President Biden was speaking, there were air raids going on. I mean, can you talk about the feeling there on the ground?
I'm sorry, I missed the end.
I was saying I can hear some things in the background. Yeah, I hear the air raids. I hear that. Can you just talk about the feeling on the ground? Are people going about their daily lives, or is it still very much people hiding and worried about the next thing?
No, people go about their daily lives. It's a matter of pride, right? They don't want to let Putin push them around. So they go around their daily lives. They have apps on their phone that alert them when the anti-air defense radar signals that there's something coming their way. And they clear out from the buildings. They go into bomb shelters if they want. They're these sort of instant bomb shelters that are put up at bus stops and things like that. They're not underground, but they're these sort of concrete shells you can go into. But for the most part, people are just living their lives.
Yeah, and I remember when we had you on for an in-depth primetime special where we really got into it just as this was beginning. But I think, for those who don't have the training in strategic military engagements like you do, for the average American, there's this, why can't we just go in there and end this? We're the United States. Why can't we just stand up to the bully? And yet there's been such hesitation to really take too many steps for fear it would escalate. So with the president now showing up, does that mean, can the U.S. just go in there and put a stop to this if we wanted to? And is that the right move?
No, the U.S. should not, and the U.S. will not enter Ukrainian territory and engage in direct contact with the Russians, except under the most dire of circumstances. One of the things that's been most important, and again, has been undercovered, so let the tram go by here, it's been undercovered, is that American forces and NATO forces have been training Ukrainians at the battalion level to do what's called combined arms warfare, combined arms maneuver, which is to say they're teaching them to wage Western-style war, to stitch together artillery fires and infantry movements and armor and drones, and to operate these things, simultaneously. And that's really a hugely important advancement for the Ukrainian military. And they've been doing that for several months now, and they're getting ready to move into an offensive stage here where they're going to display what they've learned along with the weapons that have come along with that training. And you'll see something quite different on the battlefield. So we'll see if the Ukrainians have mastered combined arms maneuver, it's going to hit the Russians hard because the Russians haven't ever fought it. So we'll see what happens in the next few weeks.
We noticed in the president's speech he was reaching out directly to Russian people, hoping that they might believe him, might hear that they're not there to, that certainly it wasn't self-defense, and that they are there to promote democracy and all of that. Does that filter through? Is there enough of a new Russian population? Like, do you see a tide turning against the old regime and Putin? Does there need to be a rising up?
It's a complicated question. For the generation that's sort of 50 years and older, most of what they watch is TV. That's where they get their news, and they are firmly behind the Kremlin. As you get into younger age groups, the they get their news from the internet, and there's a lot of truth that gets through the internet. But it's very difficult to gauge Russian public opinion because people aren't giving, honest answers because there's some danger to them. Mm-hmm. But information is getting through to Russia. You see videos every day on Twitter or on Telegram, which is what most people in this part of the world use. And so, we have to believe that the truth about the war, that the poor performance of Russian forces, that is getting through. And we do see dissent, but we don't see a large-scale movement yet, and I wouldn't expect one.
Okay. And just for those of us, people who are just hopping on the feed here, we're talking with Dr. Matthew Schmidt. We're talking about what's going on and how this is a game changer, that President Biden has showed up in Kyiv, and we are actually joining the professor from Kyiv. You happen to be right there. I asked you earlier, but I want to bring it for those who are joining us now. I think the fear of the average man and woman out there is, oh my gosh, are we headed toward World War III? And you say we're not. Can you explain?
Putin isn't crazy, despite what people say. He's quite logical, and he has every reason to avoid escalating to World War III. If he did that, NATO troops would destroy his military and would incapacitate his nuclear forces, which means that Russia would have no power on the world stage. Without its military, without its nuclear forces, Russia's an ordinary European country able to punch at the level that it can punch now, basically because it inherited the Soviet Union's, military. So he's not crazy. He's not insane. He doesn't want to lose that because he'll lose his power if he does.
Well, obviously, he seems to really want Ukraine, and he doesn't seem to be winning it, at least from what we're hearing from the experts on the ground like you, that they're really holding their own. So what is next? What's the gameplay here?
Well, the gameplay is that you're almost certainly going to see Ukraine go on the offensive soon, I would guess in a matter of weeks, to get ahead of Russians, possibly also going on an offensive. And you're going to see that port and a Western weapon. You've had a pause right now. What's really been going on is that American forces, NATO forces, have been moving weapons into place, waiting for a presidential decision on the political side to say, all right, go ahead and let those tanks go in. Those tanks aren't flying in from America. They're sitting across the border. So you're going to see a lot of that happen. And you're going to see now that you have, veteran Ukrainian troops that have been training for weeks in Germany come back in. And you're going to see a large number of Ukrainian reserves cycle back out to do that training. Ukraine's going to try to start an offensive, and they're going to try to maintain that push consistently now for weeks on end, which you haven't seen in the war yet. These sort of bursts of going on the offense for both sides, and Ukraine's going to try to sustain that momentum now, control that operational tempo.
Professor, I know you're coming to us from Kyiv, and I can sense sometimes the signal's getting weak, and I can only imagine how the technology is working as air raids are going on behind you. But I want to ask you one more question. You said most people in the media are not talking about this yet, that what the Ukrainian people are going through and just how many have been displaced.
So there are best estimates about 7 million Ukrainians inside the country that are displaced, and about 7 million inside that have had to move from their homes. That's 14 or so million out of 40 million people. That's roughly 30% of the population. Again, as I said, that's like the equivalent of the entire East Coast, every man, woman, and child being displaced from their homes, from Maine to Florida. It's an enormous, enormous problem that we're just starting to deal with. That's why I'm here, is working on a project to do reconstruction in the country, meeting with some ministry officials and things like that University of New Haven is getting involved in.
And it's when you put it in terms like that, the entire East Coast, you're right, it is hard to fathom, and of course our hearts go out to the people, and at least we have had so many things of ways, at least here in Connecticut, to help and to help refugees. But I want you to address two things before we go. In some of the papers, you've read that Putin perhaps is sick, he's old, he's maybe concealing an illness. I don't know if you think that's true. And also that he'll never let himself lose. So how does that work?
I missed the second question. I'll address the first. I don't know if he's sick or not. In the summer, the head of Ukrainian military intelligence said that he was sick and that he was going to die in the next, it was imminent. And when he was pushed, he said, well, a year or 2 years. But the head of the CIA said there's no indication that he is terminally ill. So you take it as you will. I would bet on Putin being around for a while.
And then my second question was, if clearly you're saying the military is going to show its might, they've been trained, they've got Western equipment, they've got Western fighting technologies, we're going to see a turn in the war, but yet you deal with someone, and I know you are an expert in the mind of Putin, and you always say he's not crazy, he's strategic, but how does this, for lack of a better term, bully, autocrat, lose? If I know you're saying there's a way we can win, but this is a man who seems to, he'll never pull back, according to him.
Ultimately, this ends in the streets of Moscow. Ultimately, Ukraine is freeing Russia from Putin and his system of government, of autocracy. When that happens and exactly how that happens is difficult to say. Oftentimes, people talk about the oligarchs around him, somehow turning against him. And there's a scenario where their economic interests are threatened by the continuation of the war, and that they might push for him to step down. Usually, what happens in historical cases is that the autocrat is sort of pushed out. He goes and he lives somewhere in his mansion, and he's promised that he won't be killed, and he gets to keep his money. That's sort of option number one. But on the other hand, many of these oligarchs believe in this mission. They have more money than they know what to do with, and they're trying to build a legacy for their lives too. And so they may not turn on Putin. And logically speaking, many of their fortunes are already done for in the future because Europe, which is the major buyer of Russian gas and oil, is not likely to continue to buy Russian gas and oil in the same amounts anymore, which means that these guys are not going to make the same amount of money. So they may already be deciding to just stick with Putin and run this thing through because it's a done deal. Because the markets that Russia used to work in, to sell to, are simply not going to do it again. So it's really hard to say how this is going to end.
Well, I appreciate you being with us from Kyiv, and thank you for enlightening me and the viewers out there, helping us understand a little bit more what's going on and how you think the president's visit was such a game changer. Hopefully we can continue to reach out to you in the coming days and weeks as this progresses. But Professor, thank you so much for sharing your time with us today.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Take care.
Stay safe.